This is an impromptu video on section 2 gauge swatch for the MKAL. I've worked 2 repeats just so that you have an idea of what the rows look like at this point. You should have every third row should be all knit stitches. It does not matter if they look like they're skewed because you can always go back later and tweak the legs. So when you're actually working your blanket, you can go back and make these columns look all pretty just by pulling up the leg that looks like it's receding, and you can make the columns look all nice and straight. But as far as the gauge swatch goes, the columns being pretty, not important, just as long as you can see that there's a row of all knits every third row, and there should be a decent amount of space between these two. So it should also stretch. That means I can make this go really wide. If it's not stretching, then these slipped stitches are far too tight, because right now, let me put on regular tension. Here's the regular tension of the swatch, and I can pull that sucker at least twice as far. If it's not pulling like this, then those slipped stitches are pulling too tightly. This is one slip stitch. This is another one. Now this is same idea but backwards in the next row. So this is in front, this is in back. On the back side, it'd be the opposite here. So if we pull them, you can see how far this yarn should be able to stretch, and that's just one slip stitch right there. Okay, so let's start again, starting with repeat. This is going to be the third repeat for my gauge swatch here, and I'm going to start with row 1. And my apologies ahead of time. If I would have known I was making a video, I would have made sure my nails were painted, and I definitely wouldn't be staring into a camera right now, because this is very awkward knitting through a camera. You have no 3D, and I'm kind of at a funny angle, but I think you can see the stitches better from this angle, so bear with me. All right, for row 1, we knit the first stitch, slip with yarn in back, slip with yarn in front, and repeat that. So knit the first stitch, slip with yarn in back. Now I have a decent amount of space between these two. It's a lot of space, but it's to allow that when I grab this, I kept all that space between the two. So I put my thumb on here and then grab that with my finger. This is keeping that amount of yarn there. When I grab this, I've already locked in that yarn, so I could let go because I've locked in the yarn and pulled this one now, which is pulling this yarn between them, making sure I have a lot of space there now. Now I slip with yarn in front, pull this one back, knit, holding the stitch far over, slip with yarn in back, maybe. Now I'm going to grab this and pull that there, and slip with yarn in front. I'm using this finger so that this yarn doesn't pull way out of the way. So I'm locking that stitch in there. Knit, slip with yarn in back, slip with yarn in front, knit, slip with yarn in back, slip with yarn in front, knit, back, 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 front. No, you can come back here. We're going to knit you. I said we're going to knit you. Back, front, and the last stitch is a plain old knit stitch. And that's how it should look. You should be able to see regular rows of knits still. And you're going to see that purl, well, it looks like a purl bump on this side. And that is where you slipped with the yarn in back, because it was a knit previously. So you can't even see the yarn behind it. And the knit with yarn in front looks like it's choking it even tighter, even higher up. So slip with yarn in back. The choke is from the row below. Slip with yarn in front. The choke is from this row. All right, let's flip and go to row 2. Row 2 is purl the first stitch and then repeat knit 1, purl 2. So purl this first stitch. Now, when I purl the first stitch, because this first stitch is holding on to nothing, it's only locked in, if you can see on the side, which I can't tilt it here very well. This stitch is only held onto one other side. So it's loose yarn. There's nothing for it to grab to tighten from. So in order to not get a funky wavy edge and to keep this nice straight edge, when I purl the first stitch, man, this is a weird angle. I grab this yarn. I'm going to put my thumb right here to lock that in so it doesn't move. Wrap it, pull it through. I'm still pinching that spot, and then I can let it go. So I'm pinching in this yarn. What the heck is it fuzzy? Come back here. I'm pinching this yarn so that I'm keeping how much it should be there, and I'm not pulling it too tight. All right, so the first one was purl, and then we're going to repeat. Knit 1, purl 2. Knit 1, purl, purl. And these are regular rows, no slips. So this should be pretty close to your regular tension. Not too tight though. If you're a tight knitter like me, you might have to focus on not knitting too tightly. I had to really push myself to keep this row loose, because I'm used to knitting right on the tips of my needles, as you can tell, but I knit very tightly. So you want this to be just a nice, comfortable tension. Let me be sure I didn't miss anything here. Knit, purl 2, knit, purl 2, knit, purl 2, knit, purl 2. So it should look like that. Got a knit stitch and then 2 bumps. Knit, 2 bumps. If you're ever missing, you don't know if you got your stitches in, that's what knit, purl 2 looks like. Knit looks like the little V, and then 2 pearl necklaces. The best way to think of it is a pearl necklace. Back on. Knit, purl. This is such a weird angle to knit at. Knit, purl, purl. You ever want a surreal experience? Try knitting by watching yourself through a camera. Nothing looks right. I look like I'm trying to copy the movements of somebody I'm watching on TV. It's weird. So weird. Plus my movements are so exaggerated. It's so strange. All right. Purl 2 on the end, and that's it. And should be looking like that. So once again, on my other side here, this is the wrong side, so you're not going to see the knit rows here. Here it's going to be a real, I love this fabric on this side. Here you're going to see back and forth V's. So you'll have one row that's nothing. Now, this row that looks like nothing, this is your knit row on the right side. If you can't really see it very well, but it's all purls on this side. So these 2 rows are going to alternate. These are the slip stitch rows. You're going to see back and forth V's. And then you're going to see this row that looks like nothing. There's no V, because it is the all V row on the other side. It's the all knit stitch row on the other side. So on this side, this is all purls. Back and forth V's, all purls. So your fabric should be separated where you see a double chunk of these V's, nothing. Double chunk of V's, nothing. Double chunk of V's, nothing. And once again, normal tension. Watch these slipped stitches though. They should be able to move with me. They should be allowing my fabric to open as much as it wants to. They are not choking anything. They're not stuck where I can't pull through here. I can stretch it out plenty far. That's part of the makeup of this fabric. Part of its properties is how much depth it has. That's its texture. It has a lot of depth in this texture. And the depth comes from those slip stitches, which are going to bulk it outwards. All right, let's go back to... Oh, I put that on backwards. In case you ever want to know, I'm actually glad I put it on backwards. I had accidentally slipped this edge stitch off. If you're ever wondering if your stitch is on backwards on the end, look at how it's coming through. This yarn should never make a little U here. You should never have the front coming to the front. That means I put it on backwards. The front should always go to the back. So now this is coming from the front and it's pulling from the back over there. If I pull from the back, I'm pulling from the front. So it's looping, it's spiraling around. So that's how you can identify. If you ever slip off an edge stitch, you can identify which way it goes on by where that yarn is. It should never make a little U. It should always go from front to the back. Or back to the front if it's backwards. Okay, row 3. We're going to repeat. Knit 1, slip one, yarn with blah, 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 blah. Knit 1, slip with yarn in front, slip with yarn in back. So, first stitch, knit 1. And once again, I like to lock my stitch in. You can even pinch it afterwards if you want to make sure that you're not, yanking this too far. Last thing you want to do is pull this stitch too far. It'll pull in the side fabric and you can't really fix that very well. Okay, so knit, slip with yarn in front, pull this back here. I'm holding this stitch to make sure I'm not pulling fabric off it. I'm holding this stitch to make sure that it's staying in place. Slip with yarn in back, hold it over. Knit, front, back, knit, front, back, knit, front, back, knit. Maybe I can remember the front. Come on, back, knit, front, back, knit. Now, see how this looks like it's got a lot of room here? And the last stitch was behind? Last stitch look like knit. That's how I know I have to slip in front. And I'm on another slip row because it's not all knit. And it looks like it's being choked at the top. So that tells me, hey, you got to slip in back now because it's already slipped in front. It's already choked. So you want it in the back. Now, all knits, that means I knit. It is not choked, which means time to slip in front. It is choked, time to slip in back. All knits, time to knit. Not choked, that's a front. It is choked, and that's a back. All knits, time to knit. Front, back, and finally knit. And at the end of this row, should be looking something like this. Once again, do not worry about any stitches not looking perfect. On your gauge swatch, they're not supposed to look perfect. It's just to get an idea of what it's going to be like, to give you a feel for the yarn. Even these enlarged stitches can be fixed. Watch this. I slip in front. Look, oh my goodness, my knit stitch is getting smaller. If I were to turn it around, I could actually take where it's slipped in back. Let me see if I can do it without looking at it. Oh, this is going to be tough. Where am I? Right about here. And I just made that knit stitch way smaller by pulling the slip with yarn and back one. So once you finish your section, you can go through and tweak these little legs and make your knit stitch column look all pretty and straight if you want to. Don't have to, but if you want to, you can. And the enlarged ones, like I said, the slip stitches, when you pull a little bit of yarn, it fixes the knit stitches. This will balance out during blocking too, but if you want to tweak it, it's not a big deal. If you tweak it before you block, blocking will actually set it in as that nice even look, which is pretty nice. Blocking is wonderful. Used to hate it, but now, oh my goodness, everything looks so custom when you block. And everybody asks, oh my God, did you make that? No, you couldn't have made that. It's the best feeling in the world. All right, once again, where I slipped yarn in front, let's watch how much this yarn, oh, I have to take it off. So this is the slip with yarn in front, where it looks like it's choked was slipped in with yarn in back. See it way back there? But watch again how much space. This is a knit stitch, and this is the next stitch. Look at how much space I have in yarn between this knit stitch, slip with yarn in back, slip with yarn in front, and the other knit stitch. That is a lot of yarn. It should stretch that far because if you watch, it's going to pull. The nature of these stitches, the knits are going to want to pull it back in, as will the purls on the other side. They'll want to pull it right back into where it should be. And if you're not noticing raised columns of knits, that could be one of the problems, that you're carrying your yarn way too tightly. Because these knit stitch rows, let me see if you can see it from an angle. Do I have enough angle in here? How do I get the light? That's a little bit better. Can you see how the rows look raised? All of the knit stitch rows should be raised up. If they're not raised up, then you're holding that yarn too tightly when you're carrying it. Either you're holding it too taut or you're not giving yourself enough space between. Okay, so let's go to row 4. Row 4 starts, I can't speak today. Row 4 starts with a purl one. So once again, I stick my needle in and I kind of pinch that stitch so that I'm not pulling it. Wrap the yarn and I'm pinching everything together here. So now I can just hold this yarn in place. This yarn that's on the needle is my yarn coming from the working side. As long as I'm holding this yarn in place, I can't pull any of the old yarn. So I pinch that really tightly to make sure that I am not yanking anything from the side. I want that side to stay intact so it stays nice and straight like that. So the first one was a purl. Now we're going to repeat. Purl one, knit one, purl one. Purl one. And once I get that second one, I can hold the second one. Knit one. The third stitch makes this so the first one can't move now. The second stitch, the first one can still move. Once you get the next stitch, takes it away from there because the only one this can borrow from is here. So this one's pretty much locked in. So it was knit one, purl one. All right, so we're repeating purl, knit, purl. But for me, it's easier to just do, instead of purl, knit, purl, I go purl, knit, purl, purl, knit, purl, purl. You can do it whatever way you want as long as you are knitting where you knit and purling the other two. Purl, purl, knit. And once again, you don't want this to be loosey-goosey, but you do not want to carry it tightly. If you carry it tightly, you are counteracting all the slip stitch work. Purl and purl. All right, let me double check and make sure I didn't miss a stitch here. So purl the first one, and I've got purl, knit, purl. So it should be a knit, 2 purls together, 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 knit, 2 purls together. That means there's my purl, knit, purl, purl, knit, purl, purl, knit, purl, purl, knit, purl, purl, and the end, knit, and the purl. And you can work that last stitch tightly. It will, it's okay if it's worked tightly on the back, just not on the front. On the back, it's going to pull yarn from here. So this stitch will borrow it, that second stitch. And it's okay there. Once you get to the front, if you pull it tightly, it'll mess up the whole thing, because the front will actually, let me show you. If you pull tightly on this first stitch, once you get to the front, it's going to borrow yarn from the one behind it. The problem is that the one behind it is the same stitch, because it's only connected to one other stitch. On the back, it's connected to this stitch next to it. On the front, it's connected to this stitch. But otherwise, this yarn right here is all working just one stitch right above it. So it's technically the same stitch. Half goes to the back, half goes to the front. So there's nowhere for it to borrow yarn. If you pull it too tightly, there's somebody whose picture I saw where it was waving. It should look like this on the side. Is it going to be, you know, a perfect straight line? Of course not. It can't be. It's only a half stitch. That's why we usually do selvage edges or something to hide it. But it's not going to be, you know, pulled in, pulled out. If it's pulling in, that means you're pulling that first stitch too tightly. The one on the back, like I said, you can pull the one on the back tight. It's not going to mess with you. The last two stitches on the back, you can go tightly on those. Matter of fact, usually, like if I'm working almost anything, garter stitch, stockinette, reverse stockinette, I will keep these last few stitches tight. I go to the front, I work the first two with absolute regular tension. And then either the third stitch or the fourth stitch, I'll start working 2 stitches tightly. And the reason I'll work the next 2 tightly, don't worry about it here with this stitch pattern. This is forgiving the way that this stitch pattern is. But if you do it on garter or stockinette, if you work these 2 tightly, it's gonna pull in the whole edge. It will not look good. This one borrows yarn from here. So essentially it's the same thing as tightening here. But the third one will borrow yarn from here, which means if you work 3 and 4 or 4 and 5 or even 3, 4, 5 a little bit tightly, you tug the yarn a little bit, they're going to borrow yarn from here, which means that if you were loose at all on these 2 stitches, or if you notice that every other stitch on this side is enlarged, which most people will notice on their stockinette or garter, that every other stitch on this side will be larger. If you tighten these 2 stitches, it will take away from that. So you tighten the last 2 on the back, and then like 3 and 4 on the front, and you'll notice that this whole row all of a sudden evens out. It's because that extra yarn that was in here, this dude is taking it from him, and he in turn is stealing just a little bit from him. And he's got nowhere else to go because he's too far back. He can't take it from the back because he's too far away from the stitch that's borrowing. Okay, that was my little aside. That was too much. Now, instead of repeating 17 more times, why do I have fuzzies all over? I'm going to show you again. This is how much. This is normal. Sitting on the cord, so I'm not pulling it at all. If I pull on this yarn, I should be able to stretch it really, really far. Matter of fact, now I highly suggest using a solid ruler, not using one of these. I'm using this right now just for ease because you can see it better than my see-through ruler. But as much as these are nice because they move around the body or around fabric, they're made of material, which means technically they will stretch or compress. And after time, you're going to notice that your 1 inch is actually like 1 1/8 inches. So I highly suggest using a solid ruler when you check gauge. But for now, because there's no way you're going to see through my see-through mirror, I'm going to show you how to check gauge on here. This is way too small of a swatch to count as real, because if you notice, your bottom is generally going to be a little bit more turned in. See how it's kind of turned in a little bit? That has everything to do with your cast on. Now, if this was a real piece, it would be fine because it would block evenly. It's not a real piece. So technically, I would have to be at least another inch up to get a really good accurate gauge measurement. But in order to just show you how to measure gauge, I'm going to do this with this ruler on this short little swatch here. So I'm trying to pick these up so you can see these ridges better. All right, so if I put my measurement, if I make my needle stay on the blessed table, if I put my measurement at the beginning of this knit column right here, and make sure you can see this because I can't see that part of my camera. Okay, if I put my knit measurement at the beginning of this knit column right here, so I am encompassing this first stitch. This is stitch number 1. Every knit row is going to be 3 more, okay? Let's move it down a little bit so you can see the knit rows. Let's see if I can keep this needle from not falling off the table. Dude, seriously? Can you cut me a break? Pain in the patitchkis right now. Okay. So I'm at the beginning of a knit row right here. Let's move it down a little bit. There we go. You want to make sure that you're catching about the same row. So if you were doing a swatch, I would, you know, kind of get an idea. All right, well, you should be way more. You should be like, I'm 2 inches up here. That's this stitch. I'm 2 inches up here. You could use stitch markers to mark where 2 inches up is, and 2 inches up. Put stitch markers right there into those stitches, and then just measure and make sure you have both stitch markers encompassed in that space. So here, I'm at the beginning of this knit row. I'm at the beginning of this full knit row. Make sure you can tell. This is the edge of my knit row, so I want to be lined up right with that edge of a knit row. That's why I was trying to plump these up so you could see that this is actually the right edge. So that's stitch number 1. Every third stitch is a knit row. So I've got 1, 4, 7, 10, 13, 16, 19, and right here would be 20. This stitch right here would be number 20. So 20 would be right here at like 3 3/4. This one right here would be 21, which would get me, that would pretty much get me to 4 right there. This stitch right here. Not this one, because if you look at it, I'm too close to the bottom, so it's still waving out. So if I was farther up, my fabric would look more like that. So it would be either here for 20 or here if I was further up. As of right here, it looks like it's just this one. So it looks like I have 20 stitches. So right here, if you get to your 7th knit column, once again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That would be 21 plus 1 because I started on it. So that's 20. That's not 21. It would be 18 plus 1 because I started on 1. Oh boy, this is why you don't start on 1. So that would be number 19 right here. 18 would be there, 19, and 20 would be right here. Now, if it's too much to do that, here's your knit column. If you just want to count by 3s, just start right at the end of your knit column, okay? Remember, these stitches are going to be a little bit further past where the line is, so you want to go just barely on top of that little edge right there. So you're pretty much at where this first one is starting past the knit column. Now that would mean that this is a 0 stitch. So you'd have slip, slip, knit would be your 3rd one. So in that case, you'd have 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, if I can get my split ends down. 18 is the knit column, 19 is the stitch next to it, 20 is right here, and 21 is the other knit column. So again, you can see how going too shallow is getting me different numbers. If I were to go higher, because I just used the section a little bit above it and the knits are still growing. If I had a gauge swatch that was 4 inches, this side wouldn't be growing anymore. It would have, it's already, let me make this straight. If I straighten out my, if I straighten this out, you can see this kind of really goes, and then all of a sudden it's kind of tapering straight. This is how the rest would be, nice and straight up. So it would even out and show me once I was at a proper 4 inches. I mean, look how much shorter this is. This gauge swatch right here is, I always measure right under. That's only 1.5 inches. So I haven't even gotten to the point where it's going to be even. So 4 inches is way, way up there. So if I was around right here, I could accurately measure at about the 2.5 inch mark. And you would see that I would be at probably the correct needle right now. Because according to this, you're looking at 20 stitches. 20 stitches for your gauge. And this is the actual needle. I believe this is the needle I used for that section. It was either a 10 or a 10.5. I'm using a 10 for this, just so everybody knows. This is a US 10, which on Chiago means that you can't read jack. Seriously. I need some glasses on to read this junk. This is nuts. Here, let me show you the one part about Chiagos I don't like. Do you see it? Do you see it? No, you don't see it because it's hard to read. I have to bring out my gauge checker all the time. Anyway, for reference, I am doing this on a US 10. On my pattern page, it says what I used. It was either a 10 or a 10.5, but you can see by my measurement here that it would be one or the other. If I was a little bit over the 20, then I would have gone up to a 10.5. If I was right at the 20, I would have stayed at a 10. So you can see that that's pretty damn close to what it should be. Now, once again, please pay attention to knit rows are raised. Can you see how they're, oh, I can't see that way. Let's try it this way. Can you see how they're raised? They're raised above. They should be standing well above. If they're not standing well above, if they're not obvious that they're standing above everything else, this is such a terrible light right now. Let me see if I can change this light. Does that look better? Not much. Can you see here how they're standing above? They are raised. You can see from the side. These rows are raised. They are above everything else. If they're not raised, it means you are carrying your yarn too tightly. If you can't do this, I will actually show you sizes, okay? So we're looking at about 5.5 inches there. Now, we're now looking at about 8 inches. If you can't stretch that far, then you're holding it too tightly. And let's see where I'm at right now. When I let it go, I'm almost back at my 5.5 again. And it's slowly moving. You can actually see it moving. It's kind of funny. It's pulling back in right now. So it will snap back to where it's supposed to be. But it needs that stretch to be able to push. What it's doing is the slip stitches are actually, they're bulking up the back and they're pushing these knit columns up. Those slip stitches are actually going foosh and they're forcing this up. If you look at it on the back, the slip stitches are just bulking everything up. This loose yarn is just bulking up. It wants to stay here and push everything forward there. So this loose yarn back here, I'll flip it around so you can see straight up way. This is what your stitches should look like on the back. You should be able to see one nice straight. Watch how far I can pick up any one of these. That's how loose it should be. I mean, I just picked up, now you can see on the front where it gathered all that yarn. It shouldn't gather all that yarn, obviously. You don't want it to be that tight where you're pulling away from everything else. Okay. But it should, see if I can fix it now. There it goes. It's a little bit better. But it should be able to pull. So you should be able to get a pretty decent pull out any of these. Stretch it back. It should be pretty loose, so you could stretch it out and it should look like that. You should be able to see rows of lines. If you're not seeing rows of lines like this, where it's not pulling in, it almost looks like it's standing straight. It almost looks like you have loose strands of yarn and the rest of it's just going above and below it. But these strands are just going nice and straight across. They're not being pinched down. They're not being pushed up. They're just nice and straight across. So this to this stitch is coming behind it because this yarn is just going straight through there like a train track. This is coming behind that train track. Okay, sorry about the really long video. I was hoping that it would give enough information, try to help everybody with this gauge swatch. I know this one was kind of a pain in the tootsies, so I hope it helps somebody. Good luck, guys.